One of the most popular search terms related to watercolor painting is actually watercolor flowers. I did some research on Google, and I think this is an accurate statement, and I'm not surprised. Um, I think that watercolor flowers are beautiful, and it's one of the first subjects that I tried to paint when I started watercolors. But I'm going to be honest here, I'm not good at them. I'm not even remotely great at them. Even my mom told me once after seeing one of my many attempts that, quote, there's no life in your flowers. I mean, it sounds pretty harsh, but she was right. And in this video, I'm not going to be sharing a story about how I practice, and now look, all of a sudden I'm so great at them. In fact, I'm sharing some video from two recent attempts that did not turn out well and what I learned from them. And I actually have some things that I took from these painting sessions that I feel like are reminders for how not to paint loose flowers and how not to approach loose painting sort of in general. So let's just be clear here that I'm not saying that I can't ever be good at them. If I keep practicing, I'm pretty sure I would improve. And I really believe this of anything and for anyone. You can do anything as long as you keep learning, iterating, and trying. But and this is the key, you must actually care about improving on that specific thing that you're trying to improve. You've got to actually enjoy the act of practicing whatever that subject is that you're trying to paint and get better at. For me, it's the interest that's missing with painting loose florals. And I don't mean that I don't care about painting flowers at all or that I think that they're boring or anything. I think it's that painting flowers as the main subject of the painting, really big and loose with leaves and all these stems and buds and all these other things that are going on. Um, especially when you look at those images that you see when you Google loose watercolor flowers. When I do these and I try to make an attempt at them or I feel inspired to try, that initial desire is always there because obviously these paintings that I see are beautiful. But for some reason, because I can't make sense or my brain isn't going to work that way right now of all of the forms and the shadows that I see in photos and even in real life, I tend to lose my interest is the word I'm going to use and focus. And then the painting ends up reflecting that. In fact, oftentimes my loss of focus results in overworking instead of stepping back. And I think that's just a really funny way that my brain works. It's like, I don't know what to do with all this visual information. And instead of stopping, I'm going to keep trying and put more in, even though something that's supposed to be loose is really an abstraction of what we're seeing. And for some reason, I haven't been able to balance that out for myself to create a successful floral composition. And looking at my interest and what happens when I tend to paint these flowers, at least currently in my own watercolor practice, I feel like I've told myself, I don't really believe in practicing watercolors through painting these subjects that aren't that interesting or that I lose focus on when I'm painting. So in other words, spending time putting in the brushwork, it should be spent on something that makes us feel like we're enjoying it, if that makes sense. And for some reason with flowers, I initially will begin enjoying it and I will think this is going great. I love it. And then it takes a turn and then it quickly subsides. And I never really get to a place where I have a result that I feel really good about. And I strongly believe that it takes that element of feeling good about what we've produced to make us want to keep going in some ways. Like we're never really going to reach exactly what we want, but if it's showing us that we're making progress, then we're going to feel encouraged to keep going. And if we don't feel encouraged to keep going, and then we're also not that interested in what we're painting, I think that's not really a great way to practice, and it's not going to allow our practices to fulfill us. And so I don't believe in continuing to push it unless I really want to. And so if it's not fun, I'm not going to learn as quickly as if I painted something that I actually feel invested in. I do believe, however, in giving every subject a try or two, especially if there's a curiosity there. It's even, visiting it once and then putting it down and then maybe coming back to it in the future here and there. It's what has happened with me for flowers. I've painted a little bit, I've put it down, I've come back to it a couple months later, maybe once a year. And if it doesn't feel right, then it's not really helpful for me to continue making repeated attempts because practicing the exact same way without that interest is really not going to take me anywhere. So I think painting loose florals really just ultimately feels like I'm trying on a style that doesn't quite fit, at least not at this point. And that being said, there's something to be learned from all painting attempts. So let me share how I've learned about loose florals and how not to paint them. And these are just lessons that I feel like I've gathered from my recent personal painting attempts, and maybe they'll help you. So the first lesson, let's say, that I learned on how not to paint loose flowers is to rely too much on your reference. I paint from reference, both photos and real life, and one thing is for sure, you get a lot of visual information. I've gotten much better at picking and choosing what to include and what to omit when I'm painting, but really haven't been able to do it with flowers, like I mentioned. With flowers, it's especially difficult for me to simplify what I'm seeing, and I see it all, especially the composition of how the flowers are arranged. So I tend to want to put each flower in exactly the same place that I'm seeing it instead of picking out one flower or two flowers and creating my own composition. Oftentimes, when I follow the reference photo too closely, it makes for really awkward compositions, and the green leaves always seem to look strange, or there aren't enough, or maybe there are too many. And the greenery part of the flowers really always gets me because sometimes the flowers themselves look okay, and then once I have to start adding in the green leaves and the greenery in the background, I get really overwhelmed. And really, it appears that in successful loose floral paintings is that there's much more liberty. In fact, it almost feels like one would need to create a new arrangement on the paper for a balanced composition. So you're picking and choosing flowers and kind of placing them using your own creative eye. And then the same happens with the greens. And I'm certainly really not a great floral artist in that sense. I can't come up with my own arrangements on the paper by looking at an arrangement of flowers. I really just want to paint everything I see just one for one, and that's going to be very, very difficult, especially if I'm trying to achieve something that looks loose, because by nature, an arrangement of flowers has a lot of things going on, and then I get stuck in the details. Another lesson I learned about painting loose flowers is that you don't want to be using brushes that are too small. Bigger brushes and actually bigger paper are key to painting loosely, especially loose flowers. And this time I actually tried in this video using a much larger brush than I've ever used. It's actually a different shape as well. It's a filbert. And I really do think that it showed me that I could paint looser flowers that way. And I have tried with a round brush and it hasn't been quite as big. And it really does allow this creation of really big, expressive, one-stroke type petals that contributes to that loose floral feeling. And so I would say that it was really fun and freeing to paint with such a big brush. I even painted on a larger piece of paper than I typically do, and I feel like it did help it be more successful in that sense. Small brushes are great for the smaller details, but if I were to try and paint loosely with a small brush, for the whole thing, it would instantly make the painting tighter. So small brushes are reserved for those tiny details at the end. And in order to help define what I mean by a big brush, the size that I'm using in this painting was a size 12 filbert, and I also had a smaller filbert brush, and those two kind of together helped me get the larger brush strokes and the smaller details. And I'll certainly be adopting this approach in the future to other paintings that I want to keep really loose, that are sort of this nature. And the last lesson that I learned on how to not paint loose flowers is putting in too much detail. So if you want to have loose florals, you don't want to have too much detail in there. And the way that I approach watercolor paintings is that, they tend to be painted from light to dark, which is a very standard thing. And then also broad strokes to more detailed. And by the time that I reach the detail adding stage here, I tend to struggle with how much detail to add and when to stop. And it's really especially bad with flowers. I think this is a very normal thing for a lot of people. You work from light to dark, you get those big areas, and then you get smaller and smaller with your darker values. And then you also start to put in smaller and smaller details. And by the end, your details take up bits and pieces of the painting, and I really do think that that makes it a very successful painting when you have focused areas of detail so that the eye can focus on those. But for me, there are just so many folds and shadows and spots and stamens in a floral arrangement and just in flowers in general that it's hard for me to decide what should be included and what shouldn't. this is really an artistic license here. And I think it happens in practice, where you can pull out certain details, practice them, see what works and see what doesn't. And over time, I think that there develops a sort of pattern in our brains that we can see from this practice. And I just don't have that. That's what I believe, at least. So I put in way too much. Way too many details, way too many strokes and lines for shadows and spots. And I put detail everywhere and I sprinkle it evenly throughout. And what happens to these paintings is I feel like there's no focus point and that the eye doesn't know where to go or where to rest. And at least, that's just my own self-critique of my work. And I think if I were to try and improve, one of the main things I'd need to do is learn how to make decisions about where to add that detail and what details are important for what areas to create those focal points and interests in the flowers. And perhaps over time, I'll practice flowers here and there, and as I feel inspired, and I'll find my own way to interpret them in a style that works for me, that becomes loose yet defined. But that's just not happening right now. Now, you might be wondering why I even attempted these flowers. And these paintings were actually inspired by a friend and a really beautiful floral painter, Jillian. And she has her own YouTube channel, which I'll link for you here. And if you actually want to learn loose florals from someone who paints them well, she has a bunch of wonderful videos on her channel. And she was generous enough to teach myself and my community inside of Paint With Me how she approaches loose florals by doing peonies with us. And taking the lessons I learned from her class, I tried to attempt these lilies. And this is the result that you had been seeing in this video. I made 2 separate attempts, and I'll put them side by side here for you to see sort of in a fast time lapse. And you can see where I tried to correct my mistakes from the first one to the second one. I don't think either of them were completely successful, but you can see how I'm trying to adjust my approach in both of them. One has way too much detail. The other one I backed off a little bit, but I don't think it's quite enough. And I think that this is part of our practice. And that's why I wanted to share this with you today in this video. Not everything that we do is going to turn out great. Not everything is going to turn out to our own standards and to the vision that we had when we sat down to paint that thing. And it happens to me and it happens to everybody. And I think that that's just part of our creative practices. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.